No, I remember the events from 9/11 in sequence as sort of they happened. It was a day that started like any other day, and I came to work, dropped my son off at the Lewis Little Folks, which is the lab daycare center here at NASA. And it was about 8:45 at that time. And so we had our exchange. I stayed with him for a few minutes, and then I actually had a flight out that morning to travel to NASA Langley. So I went from the daycare at 8:45 to the travel office, and at the time we had to pick up our travel orders, sign for tickets to the aircraft for our flight. And so when I was in the travel office, someone walked in and turned on the news, and they were showing the first airplane crash in the first tower, and it was horrific. The accident itself was horrific, and for folks that work NASA Aeronautics and the FAA, this is the odds of this are astronomical. So this is just something that doesn't happen. So again, begin to speculate at that time, what was the cause, how can we prevent this, and all the tragedy of it. And this was a few minutes before 9, so then I left the travel office with my tickets and went back to the office. I went to the office for the day to pick up my traveling companion and some things from the office, and I walked in and everyone was sitting in a conference room watching a little TV screen silently, and I stuck my head in and just asked them, "Did you hear about the plane crash?" And it was then that they told me a second plane had crashed into the second tower. And I remember my blood just ran cold, because there was no question at that point that it had to be deliberate. I mean, the odds of one crash were astronomical. The odds of this were unthinkable. So then I walked into the conference room, sat down, and with everyone else silently watched as trickles of news came in over the next 20 minutes or so. Then I went back to my office to call Langley to let them know. Obviously we weren't coming, made a couple calls. No one picked up on that end because they were all in their conference rooms watching the news. Called home, let my wife know that I wasn't going to be on a plane that morning, told her to turn on the news and watch the events, and then went back to my own conference room and watched as the Pentagon was struck. And more news trickled in. And as we watched, the news came in of an aircraft that made an unscheduled turn over Cleveland. And then news came in of an aircraft parked on the tarmac here at Hopkins by the NASA fence, due to suspicious activity. And all this news was trickling in, and we were all speculating as to why. We knew what was happening, but we couldn't understand why or who. And then people began to ask me, what should we do? So we started to make calls to the ad building, what should we do? And at the time, there were no thoughts of evacuation plans. I mean, all this was unthinkable, what was unfolding in front of us. So at some point during the course of the morning, maybe around 11 o'clock, I said, oh, I'll take responsibility, and dismissed our staff and said, if you need to go home, if you feel you need to leave, then go ahead and leave. And then at that point, the lab was beginning its evacuation. People were leaving, and there was a long line of traffic to get out. And my first thought was, how do I get to my son at that point? So I joined the evacuation, stuck in traffic, and finally pulled off onto the grass and walked a mile to the Lewis Little Folks Daycare Center, pick up my son. Frantic parents were there. And I asked my son last night, do you remember any of this? And he said, I remember riding on your shoulders and walking for a long time. And we did. It was a mile back. And some parent in kindness, they picked us up on the way and gave us a ride back to our car. And the whole event, while it was surreal as it was happening, there was sort of a bonding even at that time, and much more since, I think, that sort of galvanized the resolve of Americans. I certainly felt that all that was fought for and the hard-earned freedoms, that this is not something we can take for granted. And on a daily basis, I'm reminded of that, but particularly when I walk through the events of that day.
Where were you? You said you were a mile away. Where were you parked? I mean, on the other side of the center?
Yeah, the Little Folks was the old building at the time.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, 'cause I'm a newbie, so yeah. That's right. Where was it?
It's about the location of where it is now. They're at the very back.
So it was
gate.
in the back gate.
And I worked here in the main lab over in building 60.
In 60, okay. Yeah.
So,
yeah. So you had to walk. You couldn't drive over here because of the traffic.
The traffic. All exits were just a big long line of cars evacuating. I think at some point there was an official closure of the center, and they told everyone to evacuate.
Yeah.
That everyone living at the same time creates a huge...
Don Campbell was the center director back then, wasn't he?
He was.
Yeah, it was Don. Yeah, because, I mean, he was appointed by Golden, yeah. Wow.
Well, there was no precedent for this either. The federal buildings downtown, there's absolutely...
What it meant to you.
So on September 11th, I was actually sitting in my high school chemistry class. The administration comes on the PA system telling us that planes have attacked the World Trade Center, and school essentially pretty much stopped at that point. And a lot of us were kind of questioning what's going on, you know, how come school is stopping? We didn't understand what was going on. And then once more information started coming in, that plane hit the Pentagon, then we knew that there's something very serious. And it was a big lesson throughout the day, learning, you know, what this meant to us, what this meant to the country. And I knew that our country would never be the same again, and it caused a lot of uncertainty and curiosity. Throughout the rest of the school day, we pretty much, every TV had CNN on. And everybody was glued to the TV, and especially for us students, we were learning a lot. Never thought that something could happen to us on American soil. So, you know, what it meant to me, it just actually gave me a greater appreciation for, you know, it definitely, you saw what the community and what the nation can do together when we're under attack, and gave me a different perspective for, you know, being proud of this country. And that's pretty much all I have to say.
All right.
About that, pretty short.
No, that's great.
Well, when 9/11 happened, I was stationed at Fort Polk, Louisiana. I was actually sitting in the DFAC, the dining facility, eating breakfast with my squad, and we had this big screen TV in there, so we were just eating, and we're like, oh, what kind of movie is this? It was really lighthearted. And then we realized, once the news broadcaster talked about it, we were getting attacked. Everyone just stopped eating. We just looked, and it just was unbelievable. So we're here. I'm a fresh soldier. I've only been in for a year. I was in the Army. So I just knew. We just said, my buddy Baker, he said, we're going to war. Nobody said anything. The dining facility was just quiet. We're just watching. So at that moment, I felt that we were going to war. And when I signed up, on the surface level, it was for college money. But what it meant to me at that moment, it just meant that the oath that I took, it was a serious oath, and I had to live up to it. I had to defend my country if we had to. So that whole day, we didn't work. We just listened to the radio, and come to find out, some troops and squads did go overseas. It was Afghanistan at the time. I didn't go to Afghanistan, but 2 years later, I was in Iraq. But this all was a result of the 9/11 attack. It really changed my life. I have a better appreciation for just the simple things, and just being able to speak today and, tell the story of where I was when it happened. It was very significant and unforgettable, and it's really sad. I stop.
Yeah, anytime you want. Now, what did it mean to you, the experience? And you sort of touched on that, but maybe you can elaborate a little. Well, I guess you really sort of took care of that.
You want to hear more?
No, that's okay. Only if you want to. Yeah.
Well, it just meant that I really had to step up in a way differently than if I was a civilian. I had to go and really take everything that I learned in basic training, everything that we trained for, and just had to really put it into action, at that point. So I was living up and just being ready to, when I got the call, to just go and serve my country and make sure I made it back home safely to my family members. 9/11, it just, from that day on, it just led us up to today. We're still in Iraq, we're still in Afghanistan, we're still all over the world, and we just have a stronger bond, military service men and women and veterans, and veterans of past wars. It's just a stronger, tighter bond, because if you've never experienced that, you wouldn't know what it's like. So just to be able to be home and be safe and live in America, when you're exposed to a different culture that their government is really just not like, it's not a democracy. It's just not, because of culture and religion and the disparities between the U.S. and those other cultures in Southwest Asia. It's you just appreciate it more when you're exposed to that. So to me, the effects of 9/11, I was exposed to that culture, so I know what it's like. I've seen it, and I appreciate my country that much more. And when I went over, I wanted to protect my country that much more. So it inside, it just changed my outlook on life. I have a global perspective of what it's like to just be exposed to different cultures that don't believe what we believe. So I guess to me, it just really opened up my mind to what other cultures see and do, and how they live and how they function, and what they can and can't do, and some things they'll die for that we just take for granted here. So I just have an appreciation just for being an American citizen, as a result of 9/11 and my experience with the military, and just seeing everything, and just the exposure. So I'm not really sure where to stop, George.
No,
Can you keep talking?
And away we go. All right.
All right, so on 9/11, I was out in Seattle for Society of Automotive Engineers AC9C Standards Committee meeting, and I found out what had happened at 5:30 in the morning. I went into the gym and saw the one of the towers had been down, and then saw the second one. To this day, I'm still surprised. We actually continued on with the meeting that day and the next. At the end, I think, though, that was probably a good thing to do, because it gave us some focus, something to do in the time, and we weren't able to come home for several days. And I think, what did it mean to me at the time? There was a lot of concern about what had happened in our country when we get home. Even my oldest daughter at the time had a lot of concern about me flying in an airplane to come home. And now I look back and I remember how much it brought our country together, and that's what I really remember about 9/11.
So,
On September 11th, 2001, I was in the military stationed at Fort Stewart, Georgia, when I heard the news of two planes crashing into the Twin Towers. Actually, my first sergeant was on the phone with someone in the Pentagon, and the guy hung up on him, stating that a plane flew into the Pentagon. And of course, my first sergeant thought the guy was just lying in ways to get off the phone with him. With that being said, Fort Stewart was put on lockdown. It took about an hour and a half just to get on post. So what I was doing, I was at that time working as a sergeant in the United States Army. And what did it mean to me? As a soldier at that time, it meant, it put a kind of a fierce feeling into my heart, because with us being soldiers, we were always on call. And it was kind of terrifying, considering it was on our U.S. territory, our soil. So it was kind of too close to home, but being in the armed force, it meant that we had to step up our game and be more on duty as far as protecting the United States.
I was across the street from the Pentagon when the plane went in. Jet fuel immediately filled the meeting room at our hotel. What mattered most to me is that I saw the best of people in the face of a tragedy. The hotel staff actually went home, baked cookies for all of us that were stuck in the hotel. But for me personally, the bravest person in my life through that whole time was my wife, who drove down from Cleveland to Baltimore alone to pick me up. Baltimore was as far away from Washington as I could get on September 11th.
I was on my way to work when the first tower was hit, listening to it on the radio. Came to work, was able to sit in Larry Bober's office, watching the second tower get hit and both towers collapse. I instantly started praying, realizing that I have friends and family that work very close to that area, and some actually in the World Trade Center buildings themselves. I was hoping and praying that they were fine. In fact, that they were. And what it meant to me is the fact that we are no longer as safe as we once thought in this country, and that evil can come to our doorsteps, and we have to be scared and vigilant and diligent.